So normally when we go through a book of a Bible, and we've been doing this with Daniel like we do all of them on Wednesdays, I like to go through it verse by verse, passage by passage, and again, that's what we've been doing because I think that's typically the best way. So next time we'll get back to that. But this evening there's something I want to do that's a little different. I want to introduce to you the larger structure of how the book of Daniel was written, because if you see this, it'll kind of help you see the overall message that's going to help frame our study as we go forward. And there's a couple issues we're going to bring up tonight. The first one is this. Daniel is written in two languages, which is really unusual. Ezra has the same thing, but in this case, the first chapter, and that's what we've gone through already, is chapter 1, is written in Hebrew, and which is, of course, what's the Jewish language, right? And then you get to chapter 2, verse 4 specifically, and he switches to the language that was known back then as Aramaic. And then you get to chapter 8, and he goes back to Hebrew. So right at roughly half of the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic, not Hebrew. And the question is, why? Why would Daniel, a Jew who spoke Hebrew, why would he switch to this other language? Well, before I answer that, let me tell you a little bit about Aramaic. In the world of the ancient Near East, where when Daniel was alive, and for years even afterward, Aramaic was as close as people had to what you would call a universal language. So anywhere you went in that part of the world, you were probably going to find someone that spoke Aramaic, and that's what made it possible to have communication between people from different languages. And there are still languages that function that way in our world. English tends to be widespread in Europe. You go down to Latin America, Spanish, so there are certain languages that are just kind of the standard. So that's what Aramaic was in Daniel's day. It was a language that was universal. So the fact that Daniel would suddenly change from Hebrew to Aramaic tells you that he's doing something very specific. The Old Testament, when you read it in the original language, it's in Hebrew, which means it's written for Jews. They were about the only ones that knew Hebrew. But the fact that this part of Daniel is written in Aramaic, that tells you he wanted chapters 2 through 7 to be read and understood by Gentiles, non-Jewish people. So that's the first thing we're going to kind of put out there, because this is going to become important in a minute. And there's a second thing I'm going to explain about the structure of Daniel, and I'm going to get a little technical here, and I've tried to make it as clear as possible. You may want to just kind of tune out and be like, oh, here goes Gary again. But actually, if you want to understand the message of Daniel, this is kind of important. So if you think of most English writing that's trying to come to a point or make an argument about something, there's usually a specific order. It's like you would have learned this in school, I learned this in school. You start with an introduction, right, where you lay out, this is the issue or the problem I'm addressing. And then you come to the body of the text where you lay out your points, right? This is what my argument is based on now. And then you wrap it up in a conclusion. So where you summarize what you think based on the points you've made and the arguments you've laid out. The conclusion is where you're headed. So if I were to hand you an essay that I've written on why we should go back to the gold standard, which I haven't. But if I did, and you didn't have the time to read the whole thing, you could just jump straight to the conclusion to see what my main point was, what my argument was about, and then you could go back later and fill it in from the body of the text. In the ancient world, it was different. Much of the literature, they used a literary structure known as I'm going to call it a chiasm. I put see the little X in your outline there, the Greek letter chi. So we would translate it or transliterate it as chi. So like Chi Alpha, the ministry we support, it's a Greek letter, and it was written like an X. And the reason it was called that, so I'm going to try and flip it backwards so you can see what I'm doing here. As an X, right? It started here and came in and then came back out. And the point of a chiasm was that your main point was in the middle, like going into the side of a letter chi. So what they would do you would start with you start with your supporting statements, then you'd come to the center of your essay, or whatever you want to call it, and that was your main point, and then you would work your way out with more supporting statements. And that sounds weird because we don't do that, but it's all throughout the Bible. So I put one, kind of an easy one to see, from the book of Proverbs, chapter 6. And I'm going to show this to you. Verses 16 through 19 says, there are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him. Now, the little 1a, the 2a, and the 3a, those are not in the original text. I put them in there so you can see where we're going here, okay? But first of all, haughty eyes, which is another way of saying looking down on others, right? A lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that deviseth wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil, a false witness who breathes out lies, one who sows discord among brothers. So if we were thinking in a typical Western English approach to writing, we would expect that 1, 2, 3 build on each other until you finally get to the final one there at the end, the one about sowing discord. But this is a chiasm. So when ancient Jews read this, here's what they would have seen. 1a parallels 1b. In other words, looking down on others is a parallel to sowing discord, right? It makes sense. If I look down on you, you're not going to like me, we're not going to get along. 2a is a parallel to 2b, lying tongue, bearing false witness, they go together. And then 3a is a parallel to 3b, hands that shed innocent blood are a parallel of feet that run to evil. And the main point is in the middle. And how do we know it? Because it stands by itself, and there is no parallel. And so all of these statements that are being made in these verses are the writer saying these behaviors happen because of one reason. They're the behavior of somebody whose heart devises wicked plans. That's in the center. That's the conclusion. So the writer here is saying, if you've got a heart that pursues wickedness, these are the kinds of things you're going to be doing. And letting people know who are reading it, this is the kind of person you want to be careful of. So, again, that's just one I've chosen because it's really clear. But there are hundreds of them throughout the Bible. And it's not just in the Bible. Like I said, this was a very common literary structure in the ancient world. And you say, well, why would people do that? Because written materials were very expensive. Jewish people could read much more than the average society. The literacy rate among Jews was extraordinarily high. But that didn't mean Jewish people owned written materials for reading because they were very, very expensive. They were kept generally in the synagogue or in the temple, and they were brought out at special times. An ordinary person could rarely go down and buy something significant in terms of a written work. So the reason they would write with chiasms was because they were used to thinking in structures. They would see things in structures, and that would help them with memorization. Well, why would you want to memorize? Because you don't have books, or whatever the ancient equivalent was. So people spent a lot of time memorizing what they had read or what was being read to them. Now, why am I bringing this up in Daniel? Because Daniel is essentially made up of 2 chiasms. The first one is in chapters 2 through 7, and the second one is chapters 8 through 12. And again, they correspond to the languages. Chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, which means they're for Gentile readers. Chapters 8 through 12 are written in Hebrew, which means now he's turning his attention back to Hebrew readers, to Jewish people. So let's talk about the first chiasm. And I'm leaving a lot of detail out here. I'm just kind of introducing this, but I think it's useful. So chapters 2 through 7 are primarily about Daniel's life in Babylon, and specifically the interaction he had with the Babylonian kings who were all there during his lifetime. King Nebuchadnezzar, who we probably know best, and then Belshazzar, and then Darius the Mede, who becomes the Babylonian king toward the end of Daniel's life. And the point that Daniel's going to make here is that these were incredibly powerful men, but they were actually nothing more than tools in the hands of God. That's the message of the first chiasm. In fact, it takes place, the first chiasm, remember, the center of chapters 2 through 7, it takes place when Nebuchadnezzar was out looking at his kingdom and all that he said he thought he had done, and he began exalting himself. He began saying, look at what I've accomplished on my own. Let me read it to you. Daniel chapter 4, verse 28. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, is this not great Babylon, which I have built by my great mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? So you get this Babylonian king here, and he's foolishly believing that he's the one who's done this all. Look at what I've accomplished. And in response, you all know the story, God sends a word of judgment that Nebuchadnezzar is about to be humbled, which you pick up in verse 31. While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. Now, finally Nebuchadnezzar comes out of it. God allows him to return to his senses. Listen to what he says in verse 37 of chapter 4. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Now remember what I said about a chiasm, right? It comes in and then it goes out, and where it meets at the center, that's the conclusion. That's the main point of the chiasm. And Daniel 4 verse 37 is the center. So that's the main point. And remember, it's written in Aramaic. So Daniel wanted his Gentile readers to understand they saw the Babylonian Empire as the height of world power, right? And they saw the Babylonian king as the ultimate symbol of that power. And God is saying here, the chiasm makes clear, God is saying, I'm in control, not the Babylonian king, and you need to understand this. And so, again, that's the purpose of a chiasm. When you get to the center, that's the main point. That's where the argument is going. So that's number one, written to Gentiles in Aramaic. Then we go to chapters 8 through 12, also a chiasm. This time it's written in Hebrew, which means Daniel's now looking toward the Jewish people, and a lot of it is oriented toward the future. And here's the message at the center of the second chiasm, Daniel 9, verse 26. After the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. Now, I read the entire verse there because it's never a bad idea. But remember, when Daniel was first written, when the Bible was first written, there were no verses. Okay? Those were added much, much later. And so the actual chiasm, the literary center of the chiasm, is the first part of verse 26 where it says this, and after 62 weeks an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. That's the point. And so you read that and people would say, well, what does that mean? Okay, well, we have the New Testament to help us, and we know the reference to the anointed one is a reference to the Messiah, right? Who's coming still at this point. The Hebrew phrase translated cut off, an anointed one shall be cut off. Cut off was, in many cases in Hebrew, a euphemism for death. So that fits again with what we know about Jesus. He was the anointed one, he was the Messiah, but he was going to be cut off in the sense he was going to die on the cross for our sin. But then there's the second part of the verse, 26. That's not near as clear. It says, the anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. What? What do you mean Jesus had nothing? Well, think about what Daniel's doing here. Two chiasms, two different worlds, two different perceptions of reality. In the first chiasm, people thought of Nebuchadnezzar as being the be-all and end-all, the guy that had it all, right? And God says, what you think about Nebuchadnezzar isn't true. He's there because I put him there, and I will take his power away whenever I choose. Your perception is wrong. And here, verse 26, the same kind of thing is happening. People had a misperception of Jesus. Think about what happened in Jesus' earthly ministry. He initially became very popular because of the miracles, because of the teaching, but especially the miracles, lots of followers. But toward the end of his time of ministry, the 3.5 years, he's crucified and people are deserting him in droves, right? And most people, talking about Jews here, unfortunately, they would have seen him as a failure. He has nothing. What kind of kingdom does he have? So here's what Daniel's doing. 2 chiasms. And he's saying, us human beings, how easy it is for us to miss the reality. Again, in the first chiasm, Gentiles assumed Nebuchadnezzar had all the power in the world, but God reduced him to nothing, causing him to live like an animal, right? And in the second chiasm, most Jews looked at Jesus on the cross and assumed he wasn't a king, but Daniel would interpret a vision, in fact he already had at this point, that confirmed that Jesus would rule over the entire world. And that happened in a story we'll study next time we get together, where you remember the story, I won't go into all the detail, but Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, but he refuses to tell anybody what it was. He calls in his wise men and his magicians and all these people and says, I want you to interpret my dream. Okay, tell us what it was. No, I want you to tell me what the dream was. And they couldn't do it, right? And we'll get into that next time. But the point is, Daniel not only interpreted the vision, he told Nebuchadnezzar what he had dreamed. So let's read it now. This is talking about what's going to happen. Daniel 2, verses 31 through 35. You saw, O king, and behold a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron, partly of clay. So, and we'll get into that next time. Those are kingdoms that are still to come, right? Including his own. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. What was Nebuchadnezzar saying in the first chiasm? Look what I've done. Look at this great kingdom I've built. I've done it on my own. And God says, you're going to be humbled. People had it all wrong about Nebuchadnezzar. The second chiasm, it's the same thing, just flipped. People looked at Jesus and said, he's got nothing. He isn't a king. What kind of Messiah is this? And God is saying he is the one who will destroy everything else. And he will be the one who will fill the whole earth. So that's the central message of Daniel, and that's what we're going to be focusing on in the weeks and months ahead. A lot of people get worked up about all the strange vision and the prophetic words about the end of the world. There's an element of that. There's a huge element of that, and we're going to get into those passages in more detail as we go along. But all of that stuff about the end of the world and all the visions and all the dreams and all these crazy images, those serve to drive home the one overarching truth in Daniel, which is this: in this world, things are not as they seem. Number one, powerful people are not nearly as powerful as they think they are. And number two, the real power rests with God. He's the one in control, and he's bringing everything into alignment to accomplish his purposes in the world. So, those are the chiasms, those are the two languages, and we'll get into them probably here at different points in more detail, but I thought it was a good introduction to get us started. That's the message of Daniel. It's not just, freaky end times visions and all that. There is a message, and it has to do with Jesus and who he is, and world kingdoms and who they are not, world leaders and who they are not. God is in control.